Hey, good morning.
Hello.
It's Tuesday. It's Q&A time. Um, yeah,
It is.
it is. This we're gonna just jump right in. No, well, we'll probably have some nonsense. Um, this past week we talked about Ephesians 2 verses 1 to 10. In this series, the wife of Christ, talking about the church at Ephesus. And first couple, I guess the first chapter, not the first couple chapters, the first chapter, Paul starts off, I think, really positively.
Yeah.
These are the things that, as Christians, you have access to, you have availability to. And then he prays for them that they would take advantage of that, I think. And then he begins chapter 2 with,
Hey, you're dead.
yeah, you're dead.
Well, you were.
Yeah, you were dead. And the first three verses really kind of flesh that out of life before Jesus,
Yeah.
and shared that story that I discovered about the guy who was the prisoner of war during the Korean War, and how everybody thought he was dead, and he was really alive. And then, and my wife's gone this week, so she listened to the message, and when she was done, she sent me a text that said, "You should have called the message, 'I see dead people.'" Which the funny thing is, like, I had thought about that. So that movie, it's from the Sixth Sense. When did that movie come out?
Man, late 90s? I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like I was in college when we started saying that.
Mm-hmm.
But I could be way wrong.
Yeah. I think if I would have shared that reference, there would have been about 3 people that would have that would have gotten it on Sunday.
I bet more.
I was listening to a sermon this morning when I was running, and the guy referenced a movie called The Big Sick,
Yeah.
which I've never heard
I don't
of.
think I've heard that one.
And then he referenced Bend It Like Beckham, and that was
Wow.
the connecting point that people had. So
My
yeah,
daughter sent me a joke yesterday about making references to Lord of the Rings.
okay.
She told me you can't do that anymore. I said I haven't done that for a long time. So
Was that the Babylon Bee article?
yes, that's what it is.
Yeah, I saw
Yeah.
that. I thought about sending that to you, but I didn't. Yeah.
I said, I haven't used any for a long time. Actually, I made a joke about a hobbit's age or something, something dumb. And she said, fellowship. That's all she replied.
Okay.
I said, I'll use that one until I die, because it's a good one.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. So yeah, Paul talks about the concept and the idea that before people are united with Christ, he says we're dead. I'm curious. Do you? And this is unprepared, so I guess we are going to have some unprepared stuff. Do you see that? Where do you see that concept of being dead, like in relationship to a relationship with God? What are some ways that maybe some Old Testament things or some Old Testament concepts and idea, like where does that get kind of teased out elsewhere in Scripture?
It's a good question.
As I was asking it, I was racking my brain trying to think of some.
Well, I think like just knowing that we are. Okay, this might get a little
Okay.
widespread. Knowing that we're made for eternity, we're made not just for this world, and knowing that the source of life itself is God, then separation from that God would mean death. Separation from the source of life. in the Old Testament, they talked about, when they were laid to rest, put in the tomb. They sometimes talk about resting with Abraham or resting with their fathers or buried with his fathers. But I think there's this eternal perspective that you can be separated from the God that made you, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is how he was usually often referred to there. And I think that, in my mind, separation from God is death. When he formed the world, when he made man, I love the picture that Genesis paints of him making man and then breathing life into man. And that breath of God is what brings life. Well, if I separate myself from that breath of God, then I have essentially separated myself from life itself. And I think, to me, that picture is throughout the Old Testament. Jonah talked about, when I was in the depths, and the picture that he painted, or that's painted of him, being utterly hopeless, and the only thing he had left was death, until God intervened. And then Jonah decided to pout about that, but that's probably a different topic.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, when if we were to get into Psalms, I think we would see people talking about separation from God in that same way. When we get into other prophets, when we get into Jeremiah, we would see Jeremiah talking about a separation from God in that way. And I think it is Jeremiah at one point that cries out for death. And Job was certainly in that spot. And to go back, you brought up Adam. To go back to Adam and Eve, the punishment for what the thing that they were told would happen to them if they violated the law was they would die. So, and that's probably another Tuesday Q&A also. But there is very much that image of them being cast out of the garden was an image of them being, in some ways, cast out from God's presence, which, again, we could talk about that quite a bit on another Q&A. So I guess I was just asking that question. So it's not necessarily a new concept that Paul was talking about.
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't think it would have caught, as a concept, I don't think it would have caught the Ephesians by surprise. I think they were very familiar with the idea that people could be spiritually dead. What would have caught them by surprise was that was being applied to them. Yeah. Maybe. But at the same time, these were the Ephesian Christians largely that would have been reading this, and so that may not have been a surprise to them either. They may have realized that and it was a mix. There were Jew and Gentile. On the Jewish side of things, they could have seen in our adherence to the Jewish laws and customs, we were dead. And the Gentiles too, from their perspective, would have seen, we were on the outside looking in. Yeah. We were dead. And so Paul really defines that as, you were once dead because you were separated from God. It's interesting. Well, I don't know if we're ready to shift to there, but it's interesting how how Paul talks about just how they could handle that separation, and how Christ handled that separation. If being separated from God is leading us to death, or puts us in that category of being dead, then what are we going to do about it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's, what are we going to do? And the picture that he paints in those 3 verses is really, there's nothing you can do. This is who you were. And that's why when I was sharing a little bit on Sunday, really trying to land home that point of, if all we maybe are is a little messed up, then I can kind of fix myself. Like there are some practices, there are some disciplines that I can put into place to maybe not be as bad as I was before, and to think of myself as kind of progressing to be a better person, which I really think is a lot of the ways that our culture and our society talks about these kinds of things. Certainly in terms of, we're way better than those people who built Civil War memorials 100 years ago. We've advanced past that. We're way beyond, and I think we could kind of fill in the blank with any sort of moralistic advance that we would categorize ourselves as we're better than those people who thought this way, who did that. And that's really not the kind of thing that Jesus or that Paul is writing about here. What he's saying is, no, the problem isn't just that you're not morally advanced enough. The problem, the diagnosis is you are dead.
Yeah.
And dead people can't do anything.
Yeah. And I think it's important that, like, Paul's not just pointing fingers here.
Right.
He says all of us used to live that way.
Yeah.
We followed after whatever we wanted. And that's been all of our stories at one time or another. Yeah. And Paul says that that leads us to be subject of God's anger, just like everyone else. But instead of, and I like how you talked about how those 2 important words here, he sets up this whole, you've been dead because of your sin, you've been dead because of your disobedience to God, because you chased after whatever you wanted. You became an object of God's anger. But instead of that, but God, rich in his mercy, turns that elsewhere.
Yeah, so the reality of your state is X, but let me tell you not what you can do to avoid that, but let me tell you what God has done so that you can avoid that. Now that Shane's news is out. So if you didn't know, one of our pastors, Shane Coop, has recently been diagnosed with cancer, and they're navigating that whole thing. I think they're like 10 days in, 14 days into finding out this news, and so I won't talk. So that's what's going on in Shane's life. I won't talk about that from Shane's perspective. I'll share briefly from the perspective of my wife and I. When Ann was diagnosed with breast cancer, it would have been one thing if we would have went to the doctor and the doctor would have said, you know what, you got cancer, and that would have been it. But what happened instead was, here's the diagnosis, and this is what the treatment process is going to look like. So you don't have to remain in this state. And I really feel like there are people that I've had interactions with, like when they read something like those first 3 verses from Ephesians chapter 2, like it confirms the worst of who they thought about themselves. And if I just stop at verse 3, man, God is a really mean, nasty, vindictive, wicked being, and I could never worship a God that says this.
Yeah. Or the opposite of that, kind of God's right to be angry with me because I rejected him. I'm a horrible person. I can never undo that.
Right.
But God, because he's so rich in mercy, gave us life instead. Like he didn't leave us in that dead state.
Right.
He gives us life, just as he breathes life into Adam. He breathes life into us spiritually. He doesn't just leave us dead in our sin.
Right.
By what he did with Jesus and through Jesus.
What did, like when you reflect on your own story, like what did you being dead, like what did that look like? How did that manifest itself? When you think of just about your own stuff, when your own journey, like what did, if Paul were to write this to you, Mike, you were dead. Like what did that look like for you?
I think in a lot of ways it probably looked like for Paul. Paul grew up as a religious kid. He grew up learning from good teachers and following their example and doing what they told him to do. And that's pretty much that's my story. I was a pretty compliant kid.
When did that change?
I had that kernel of contrarianism in me, but I usually kept that pretty stifled and under control. Now I just let it run all over the place.
He does.
So
that's the fruit of new life.
Yep.
Is full on contrarian. Okay, keep going. Sorry.
I was a kid in Sunday school class with the answers. I was a kid in math class with the answers. I was a good kid doing the good things that I knew other people wanted me to do. As I grew up a little bit in middle school and high school, I came to understand that I was never going to be good enough to, like, I could be good enough to get along with everyone, but I was never going to be good enough to fix any brokenness inside of me. And I began to sense, as you grow and mature, as you begin to differentiate yourself from your parents in your teen years, you become your own person more than just an extension of them. As that was happening in my life, that development, that was a time when I really started to see a desire to make my own choices, not because it's just what someone else told me they wanted, but because it was what God wanted and it was what was right. So Paul had this upbringing where he's learning all the religious answers, he's following all the rules, zealously, he says, protecting what he saw as what was religiously correct. And then he has this experience where he miraculously meets the resurrected Jesus. I didn't have a blinding light as I was walking down the road or anything like that, but in a lot of ways, I had moments of confrontation with the resurrected Jesus as I interacted with friends from church, as I grew in the interaction that I had with Christian parents. Christian, I can think of a handful of some of my best friends from childhood that showed me Jesus. Former youth pastor here at it was the church at Bryant then, that was a great example for me of here's who Jesus is, in the way that he treated really all of us middle schoolers and high schoolers and everybody else around him. And so in those encounters with Jesus, I began to see that there is more than trying to be good and do all the right stuff. There's a life that is full, not full of activity, but full of meaning, and full of his mission, really. And so that's where I would say that my realization that I was dead in that began to grow, and I simultaneously my desire to not be dead began to grow. I realized that Jesus didn't die so that a pretty good kid could be a little better. He died so that a dead kid could come to life. That's the life that he came to give us.
Well, I think what's interesting about what you're talking about is, if I was someone peering into pre-conversion, like whatever that looked like, if I'm someone peering into the life of pre-conversion Mike, my hunch would be that everyone looking into the life of pre-conversion Mike is not dead.
Right.
Mike is not spiritually dead.
Right. You can be very spiritually dead and look very much alive. Right.
And I think that goes back to Anne's thing of I see dead people. I think there can be a way, and this is one of the things I really was trying to communicate on Sunday. You can be physically alive and be spiritually dead. And not know that you're dead.
Yeah.
And over a period of time, like you've described, become more aware of that spiritual reality. And I think if we were to peer into the lives of, I'll say many. It's probably not. Maybe it's most. I'll say many. I'll be nice. I'll say many. Maybe it's some. If we were to peer into the lives of many of the people that are kind of in that mode of doing all of those right things, they might look like they're people who are very much alive, but the reality is something dramatically different. So I shared a little bit about my own story. I mean, contrast what Mike was talking about and finding, I guess, doing all of the right kind of things, the right orientation, but still that's just as spiritually dead as my own, like, I would say, typical conversion story of pursuing all of these other things and constantly coming up empty. And that deadness was, I was living fully in my deadness, not necessarily thinking I was dead, but I was embracing, I think, more intentionally embracing a dead pursuit and following that with one dead pursuit after another until whatever that realization moment was of, okay, this this is really what I'm doing, trying to find and pursue meaning in all of these things, and it's just not there. So,
Yeah, I think even if we don't acknowledge that we're dead, Scripture says God's placed eternity in our hearts. And
Yeah.
I think a part of what that means is there's something in us
Yeah.
that recognizes that we're dead and is going to search for life. And unfortunately, we often misdirect that search into things that can never provide us life.
right,
You're never going to get life from something that's dead.
right.
You can only get life from life.
Mm-hmm. And it's in the same way that they would have peered into your life and said, yeah, Mike's alive, like people would have peered into my life and thought the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not talking about Christians, but I would say non-Christians certainly would have peered into my life, and there would have been, John's not, what does that mean, Dad? Look, he has all of these things, he's doing all of the, like, that's not dead. So I think somewhere in here is a little caution for us. How can we make sure that we are not dead? And the answer is, so what did you do about it when you had that recognition? And I know it's a loaded question, and I'm setting you up. But what did you do about it?
Well, I started going to church more often. And no, I'm just kidding. Really, there was nothing I could do about it except acknowledge and accept what Jesus had done.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where Paul states, God is so rich in mercy, and he loved us so much that even though we were dead because of our sins, he gave us life when he raised Christ from the dead. It was when I acknowledged that I gained life because of the resurrection of Jesus. And if I could connect myself to that, then I could gain life as well. As Jesus was physically dead, visibly dead, God was able to bring him back to life. And he made the Spirit by which he did that available to all of us other dead people.
Right.
And if we could somehow connect with that Spirit and allow him to live and move and breathe in us, in me, then I could also participate in life. And so, simply put, I didn't do anything.
Yeah.
I quit trying to gain life and find life on my own. I didn't have to go on some pilgrimage to California or Jerusalem or some religious place. I had to quit chasing after lesser things. I had to quit looking for life in my own behavior.
Yeah.
And incremental changes in my behavior, those weren't doing it. Those weren't really getting me anywhere. And that's because the way Paul continues, he raised us from the dead along with Christ and seated us with him. It's he raised us. We didn't climb up there ourselves.
Yeah.
I didn't get a step closer with each religious box that I checked off. I did this thing, then I did this thing. It was he raised us up. And that's so that God can point to us as examples of the incredible wealth of his grace and kindness toward us. We don't earn life. It's given to us by God, and then he points back to that as an example of his grace.
Yeah.
That's part of the function of our living, is to be examples of his grace and kindness. Which probably means I need to make sure and reflect that grace and kindness to the people around me.
Well, and that's where,
not just accept all that. Wow, this is great to have
Yeah.
all this, but I should probably make sure that I'm letting that flow through me to other people as well.
and that's a big reason why, another thing I tried to communicate on Sunday is Paul, like if we were to kind of step back from the details and we were to look at the forest, or the bigger painting that Paul is painting, the bigger picture that Paul is painting in this story. Right now it seems kind of isolated. It seems like he's kind of jumping around. But what you just said, when we talk about chapter 4,
Yeah.
this is a significant paraphrase. He says just that. So because of all of these other things, live this way, and this is what that looks like. So instead of starting off the book of Ephesians with that,
Yeah.
he really has to do some foundational work to make sure that everyone who's reading this understands what's available to them. So spiritual blessings, how it's available through prayer, who they were, so
Yeah.
separated from God, who they are, united with God this week, who they were, separated from one another, who they are, united with one
Yeah.
another. And because of all of these things, now we have a life to live. And he kind of teases that in verse 10 of chapter 2 when he says, and God did all of this so that you would do the works that he's planned in advance. So it's a little
Yeah.
hint of what's going to come later in this story, later in this letter that he's written to the church at Ephesus.
Yeah, it's almost like he's sewing this tapestry.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about sewing.
Yeah, I
But
don't
to
either.
me, it feels like he's sewing this tapestry, this big giant picture made of string, and you can see little bits of it kind of loosely, and then at the end he pulls this one string and it tightens everything
Right.
and makes it focus into one picture.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this before. You might have seen one of those people that like is painting something and you have no idea what they're painting, and then they finish and then they do something
Flip it
kind of crazy.
upside
They turn it upside down,
Yeah.
and it's like all of a sudden like it all comes into perspective. And Paul seems to be here in a very scattershot way, talking about a lot of things that seemingly don't have a lot of connection right now. But that's one of the reasons. So WestWay plug, shameless WestWay plug. That's one of the reasons here that we try to look at whole books or whole concepts and not just individual pieces, because most of the time it's a better picture when we look at the entire picture.
Yeah.
And I like, so you didn't, yeah, you answered you fell into my setup question. What did you do? Accept. I mean, that's, if there's anything that we do, which I don't know that there's anything we do except we submit to what God's desire is for us. And I think sometimes we might answer that question, what did you do about it? We answer it with, I went to church more, I prayed more, I'll be controversial. I answer that question with, well, I believed, I repented, I was baptized, and I confess. None of those things are wrong. And at the same time, none of those things gave me salvation. That is something that came from God. But God, I was deserved of wrath, and God gave me mercy and kindness instead. And what did I do? It was submit. And I know, like we had a baptism here on Sunday, and when I talked to Katrina, one of the things I said, just our own journey when we were talking about baptism, was we kept reading all of these things in Scripture about what it said about baptism, and it was constantly like putting up this walls and, yeah, but what about this and what about that? And ultimately, what we did was we just accepted what the Bible had to say. we accepted that salvation comes through Jesus.
Yeah.
So in the same way, just like out of your deadness, you accepted that life that Jesus was breathing into you. It was the same thing for me. It was just, okay, like I've done all these things. I've pursued all these ways to find meaning and purpose and all of those kind of things. And then I even tried a bunch of self-righteous things so that I could earn God's favor, and that doesn't work. So how about I just accept what God has done for me and find rest and comfort in that?
Yeah, and I think that's the key, is being able to rest in that.
Mm.
I love the picture that Paul paints in Romans 6 when he talks about baptism as a death and burial and resurrection
Mm-hmm.
that sort of is a reenactment of Jesus' death and burial and resurrection. And I think there's no new life without acknowledging the death.
Right.
There's no resurrection without the burial. And I think we have to choose to set aside the dead, the carcass of our life, and allow Christ to work in us, to live and move and breathe through us, in us. And yeah, it really is an act of will more than an action. It's a submission.
Yeah.
You could have great gifts under your Christmas tree, but if you don't open them, what good are they?
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, God's grace and kindness is there for the taking, but we often want to find other ways to find life. There aren't any.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, my takeaway, my encouragement from this is, what does it look like for me to come to that point of, yep, this is who I was, and I just need to accept the work that Jesus has done for me, not trying to earn it, not trying to work it, not trying to gain it under my own power, but just really find satisfaction in what Jesus has done for me. Because he has plans for me. He didn't just make a masterpiece. He didn't just create me and then set me in a museum for people to walk by, and certainly not me. For people to just walk by and say, wow, that's a masterpiece. No, we were created to image God, to do those things that he has planned in advance. And next week, when we continue through this, begin in chapter 2, verse 11 to 22, I think is the end of that chapter. We're going to talk about what some of the works that God has for us, or one of the works that God has for us, is to be in right relationship with other people. So that's coming up on Sunday. So I hope you'll be here for that, because being in relationship with other people is a good work. That helps me live that helps me live.
Yeah. I think it's a good indicator of life or death.
Mm-hmm.
I recently had somebody ask me about, tell me about a time when you had a hard time forgiving somebody.
Mm.
And as I thought about it, it was kind of like, once I realized how much I needed forgiven, it's not that hard to forgive. And that to me was an indicator of when I stopped being dead and start being alive, is because that grace and kindness that led God to be forgiving
Mm-hmm.
also leads me to be forgiving.
Mm-hmm.
That life is in action in my life.
Right. So we have a few things coming up that we just want to remind you of, share with you. October 6th, we have two new short-term Sunday school classes starting. One is going to be led by Mike and Marcia. They're going to be talking about finances. I love the way you talked about that on Sunday. Like, it's an area of our lives that we all struggle with. It's an area of our lives that we all deal with. And many of us, I'll lie. Actually, I won't say many. Most of us struggle and have a difficult time navigating our finances.
Without going into a lot of detail, I think that's probably because we think we need to handle that on our own, and we just don't talk about it. We think of our finances as a personal thing, and we don't allow the community of Christ to have any bearing on what we do with our money.
Right.
And I know you can take that in some pretty negative directions too, that we're not going to go into. But I think part of why so many people struggle with money so much is because we think of it as a personal thing instead of another way that we can reflect the kingdom of God and His kingdom values. So we're going to spend some time in the class approaching finances that way. We'll probably ask some uncomfortable questions about finances and divulge some uncomfortable information about finances maybe. I hope that it'll be something that'll be helpful to whoever is there. I know whenever I look into God's Word, as long as I'm paying attention, I find something helpful. So That's what we're going to do.
Yep. The other class that's going to begin, also short-term, 6 weeks, we're going to have a class on marriage. Sacred marriage is what it's called. So if you are married, looking to be married, want to be married, want to learn more about marriage, have been married, this is a good opportunity for you to just kind of be reminded of some really practical things so that your marriage is imaging Christ. So as much as our finances, the way we utilize our finances, is a reflection of what we believe about God, our marriage is. In fact, that's what Paul writes coming up in Ephesians 5. So we want to be really practical with our church body on this. And then on October 19th, we have a family life workshop from 9:30 to 11:45. And we want to equip parents and families to make disciples of their kids. So that's the short version. And that's not just for parents of little children or parents of middle school and high school children, but it's for parents of adult children, for parents or for grandparents. So I fall into both of those phases. I have adult kids, and I'm still their parent, and I still have the responsibility to make disciples of them. So if you're in that stage of life, we'd encourage you to come as well.
Yeah, it'll be a good couple hours of kind of covering some of those different phases and preparing for some of those different phases. You'll have a chance to share your own experiences with the people around you, and we have a lot to learn from each other.
Yeah.
And so we want to make sure that we're making space for that to happen. And at the same time, we have some specific responsibility that God has given each of us that He hasn't given anybody else, as far as it pertains to our own kids. I've said before, my first church is the one that lives in my house. And that's not true of me because I'm a pastor. That's true of me because I'm a father and I have kids in my house.
Yep.
That's true of you as well if you have kids. And your responsibility to them, to disciple them, is huge. And so we want to make sure that we're encouraging parents in that we're equipping parents in that, not only as their kids are small, but as they grow into adulthood. And there's some tough transitions in there, and I still wrestle through, like, Emily's been out of the house now. This is her second year at college. And I don't know what I'm doing. I'm making it up as I go and trying to follow faithfully with what God has called me to do. I probably make some mistakes, and I need to learn from others that have gone before me, and hopefully I'm doing that. And I think all of us are in that boat.
Right.
When you have children, and every child is different, there's no template. I mean, there are
Right.
templates, but how effective have you found those to be?
Right.
So we're not going to give you another template, like here's the mold that you squish your children into and out they pop in a disciple. But making disciples of our families is what we'll be focusing on. And I think that really is foundational for what the church is called to be.
Yep. So that's those are just some things we have coming up in October, and then we have trunk or treat and Thanksgiving, and I can't believe it's already September 24th. So yeah, there's lots of ways to connect and demonstrate that we have life and be life-giving to one another. So thanks for watching today. Appreciate everything that our church body does and the way that they demonstrate Christ's love to one another and to our community. And we will see you on Sunday. Again, we'll be talking about Ephesians 2, 11 to 22, about what Christ's resurrection does for us in terms of relationship with one another. So thanks for watching. Have a great rest of your week.
See ya.